know exactly what you're saying, but let's be clear here. The Soviet Union was not a hegemon. The United States stayed in Europe after World War II ended for the purposes of containing the Soviet Union, and of course the Soviet Union was contained. It never dominated all of Europe. It was not a regional hegemon. And my argument is you don't want China to be a regional hegemon. My argument is the best situation for the United States is to be the only regional hegemon on the planet. Now, I think the issue that Steve Wall raised and you're raising, which is what I don't disagree with, is a somewhat different issue. And that is that the United States needed some rival great powers, not a rival regional hegemon, but it needed a rival great power like the Soviet Union or like China and Russia today to prevent it from spinning out of control. And I think the key point here is that once the Soviet Union breaks apart, the Cold War ends, Soviet Union breaks apart, and you have this badly weakened Russian state replacing the Soviet Union, and that Russian state cannot be considered a great power. We're in the unipolar moment, and there's no one or hardly anyone to check the United States. And the United States doesn't have to prioritize. And this is why you can make a very good case that the grand strategy that the United States adopts once it's the unipole is global hegemony, or what people like us sometimes call liberal hegemony. And we felt there were hardly any checks and balances on us. And you want to remember that in the early 1990s, China was nowhere near as powerful as it is today. Nobody considered China a great power in 1992. And the Soviet Union was gone by December 1991. So the United States was Godzilla. And I often think of Lord Acton's very famous phrase that, what is it about absolute power? You remember that phrase, Glenn? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think it was something to that effect. But we had absolute power, and we were, not in a position where we thought we had to prioritize and we thought we could run the globe, and got into all sorts of trouble. So I don't disagree with the basic point that Steve and you were making.
Well, if we would, take off our American shoes and jump into the Russian ones, how would you assess their, options, strategic options? Because I always thought that, after the Cold War, the best approach for them would be to integrate with the Western countries. That is for economic security. But of course, this was not forthcoming. They weakened, and then they saw all these strategies or all these plans and deals for a pan-European security architecture went out the window, and the West said, well we're going to go with collective hegemony instead. That is, to cement the unipolar moment. So then manifests itself in NATO expansion. They start to see, this essentially restarting the logic of the Cold War. Everything becomes zero-sum bloc politics, and of course, as the CIA director William Burns wrote, Ukraine was the reddest of red lines, and in 2014, this a huge shift happened. They decided, okay, this is the time where we essentially stand our ground. We'll have to take back Crimea. And they also began then arguing, well, we can't develop our economy anymore with the West. Let's reorient it all to the East with China and others. And this is the only path to multipolar world. But now, of course, during a war, what are the strategic options for Russia now? Well, what is it that they can do? And, well, not should do necessarily, but what is it that they can do? Or how do you read their grand strategy altogether, not just policies?
Well, I think that when the Cold War ended, what the Russians wanted to do was create some sort of security architecture in Europe that they were firmly integrated into, and it would produce a stable order on the continent. I don't think, as I tried to make clear before, that the Russians saw the United States as an adversary. The Russians were interested, the Soviets before them and the Russians were interested in keeping the United States in Europe and keeping NATO intact. The Russians understood that the Americans served as a pacifier in Europe, and that was especially important vis-a-vis the German problem, because when the Cold War ends, of course, Germany is reunited, and the Russians care about that, but it's much less of a problem if the Americans are there. And the Americans in the 1990s, it's hard to believe this today, but in the 1990s, the Americans didn't view Russia as a meaningful threat. It wasn't a meaningful threat. And as I often say, NATO expansion in the 1990s was not aimed at containing Russia. This was the era of global hegemony, or the era of liberal hegemony, and the United States was interested in spreading NATO, the European Union, and other institutions eastward. We were interested in promoting democracy through the color revolutions in Eastern Europe. And I don't think it was directed at Russia. I think it was mainly us trying to, spread the order that had existed in Western Europe during the Cold War into Eastern Europe. We foolishly didn't want to bring the Russians into that order. And I think that the reason we didn't want to bring the Russians in is we understood that Russia, although it was no longer a great power, was still a quite powerful country and would stand up to us if we tried to push it around inside those institutions that we dominated. For example, there was no way the United States was ever going to let Russia into NATO, not because they were worried about the Russian threat, but because Russia was a reasonably powerful country that would not be easily pushed around by the United States. And the United States likes to run institutions in which it can push other countries around. That's what we always liked about the Europeans, the Germans, the Norwegians, not the French so much, but the British. They did what we told them to do for the most part. That wouldn't be the case with the Russians, so we didn't want the Russians in NATO. But anyway, it all blew up in our face, as you well know. And now we're in a situation where the United States and Russia are basically mortal enemies, and the United States and the Russians and the Europeans are basically mortal enemies. So the question is, what do the Russians do at this point in time? It's quite simple. They go to great lengths to have good relations with China, and they go to great lengths to have good relations with North Korea and with Iran. Those are the four countries that are at the top of the American hit list: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And unsurprisingly, the Russians are working with all three of those other countries. We see all sorts of evidence that there are North Korean troops in Russia today that may be involved in an offensive in the northern part of Ukraine. Who knows for sure, but who have fought in Ukraine on the Russian side before. So this is hardly surprising. And there's all sorts of evidence that the Russians and the Chinese are helping the Iranians. So I think at this point in time, from a Russian point of view, countering the United States is of enormous importance. And then furthermore, what they have to do, and they're trying to do, is cause trouble inside of Europe itself. The Russians view the Europeans as an enemy, and they want to do everything they can to sow dissension in Europe and cause trouble in Europe moving forward so that Europe can't cause them trouble. And then finally, I think they will go to great lengths to turn Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state that can't threaten them. But I think for the moment, those are the principal goals, not the only goals, but the principal goals that Russia has.
Yeah, about consensus. There was in the 90s when there were some discussions around NATO, well, Russia joining NATO. I remember the American ambassador to NATO, he made the point that NATO was about a consensus culture. That's the, the Europeans falling in line. It was referred to as a consensus culture, and it would be difficult to get Russia into this. I guess, the size, the more independent for policy making as its own center of power kind of prevented this. But well, for the Russians, so they did, in the 90s, they were hoping that the OSCE would be this inclusive security architecture, all built on the Charter of Paris for New Europe. When that was, essentially, hollowed out by NATO expansion, first Yeltsin and then Putin suggested, we can join NATO. That didn't work after 9/11. We know that Putin, he wanted to be the first one to call Bush and say, let's find a way of cooperating, essentially putting us in the same camp. It didn't prevent another round of expansion of NATO. 2008, they proposed, under Medvedev, they proposed this new European security architecture. It was kind of brushed away. 2010, they wanted the EU-Russian Union. Also, the Europeans threw cold water on it. And by 2014 was kind of the breaking point, though. This is when, by pulling in Ukraine, that signaled very clearly that all the people in Russia who had still some dreams of a gradual integration with the West, they realized that this was the ultimate, test. This is the West deciding that Russia should be a frontline state, not a bridge, by essentially putting a new dividing line there. So given that the Russians are now in this position that they see it's not possible to make peace anymore with the West, they're effectively fighting a war. It's in their interest to cause some disruption and problems in Europe and will more or less destroy Ukraine, as you pointed out. What can the Europeans do with this, though? I mean, in Europe, they're watching the Americans, how they see the world, how they have to adjust. They see the position the Russians have, that is, the incentives they have, how they should make their priorities. How do you see the European options in this? Because it's very hard. I mean, for me, this, you and I talked about this before, this is often the most confusing part for me. I don't understand quite what they're doing, because if there's no off-ramp for the Russians, except winning this war, why escalate? I don't understand what they're going for.
Well, I think at this point they're just locked in, and they're flailing around. It's just hard to see what alternative. It's hard for them to see what alternative strategy they have. The sunk costs here are just enormous. Look, if you go back to the early 1990s, Glenn, when the Clinton administration first started NATO expansion, at that point in time, the Clinton administration and the Europeans had a deep-seated interest in having good relations with the Russians. It's just very important to understand that as NATO expansion proceeded throughout the 1990s, and remember the first tranche of expansion is 1999, at the same time the Clinton administration was pushing NATO expansion, it was going to great lengths to tell Yeltsin it was not a threat to Russia, and that the Clinton administration wanted friendly relations with Russia for the foreseeable future. It's very important to understand that. But what the Clinton people didn't understand, but many people did understand at the time, is that once you set the train in motion for NATO expansion and you effectively open the door to endless expansion right up to Russia's border, you had created a situation that at some point was going to blow up in your face. People like Kennan said this loudly and clearly. But the Clinton administration and subsequent administrations, as well as the Europeans, did not believe this logic. They thought that you could have your cake and eat it too. They thought that you could continue to expand NATO on and on and on and still have good relations with the Russians. Of course, as you point out, it really blew up in their face in 2014. But they were so committed to this belief that NATO expansion was a wonderful thing, and that countries like Ukraine had a right to become a member of the alliance, and that there was nothing that could get in the way of that. And therefore, they had to soldier on. So when after 2014 happens, there's no backing off. The Europeans and the Americans continue to push forward. Then comes late 2021. This is a couple months before the war breaks out on February 24th, 2022, right? The Russians are desperately trying to work out some sort of diplomatic solution so that Ukraine doesn't become part of NATO and we don't have a war. But the Europeans and the Americans simply won't listen. They don't try to accommodate the Russians. It's actually quite amazing. Just go back and watch the footage from the Munich Security Conference in February of 2022, the year the war broke out. It's very clear from watching the American and European leaders that they're not worried about a war breaking out, right? So what you see here is that the Europeans are so deeply committed to NATO expansion and so deeply opposed to the idea that Russia could prevent that from happening that they're at a point where they almost can't turn around. They just have to keep pushing forward. The sunk costs are just so great. And that's the reason you see virtually no evidence today, even though the war is going badly for the Ukrainians, and even though the Americans are reducing their commitment to Europe and to the Ukraine war, there seems to be no ability for the Europeans to sit back and say, things have not gone well, we're in deep trouble, it's time to reflect on this, and time to come up with a new policy. You see none of that. It's just more of the same. And the point that I'm making to you, Glenn, is if you go back to when the decision was made to expand NATO in the early 1990s or mid-1990s is when the decision was firmly made, it's just been this inexorable march towards more and more expansion, just a profound commitment to this basic precept that we have to have an open door policy and Ukraine has to be a member, period. End of story.
Yeah. No, it's, the point of being locked in, it seems about right, because they kind of made not just a commitment, but an ideological commitment as well. So it's very hard to break away from this. But I think also in the 90s, some of even the people recognized that this would alienate Russia. If you listen to people like Madeleine Albright, they did recognize this is going to cause problems with Russia. But if that problem comes in the future, then at least we'll have NATO there. That was the main point. So in other words, NATO expands, the Russians will become more unhappy and more concerned. However, as NATO expands, the power distribution shifts as well. And this would essentially force the Russians to adjust to new realities. That is essentially the hegemonic piece. Well, if you're not happy, tough luck, but this is the way it's going to have to be. But I guess one thing that went wrong with it is that, yes, if the European continent would be isolated in the world, but at the periphery, you have this rise of other powers, primarily China, I would say, which gives suddenly... I remember Brzezinski was pointing out that the worst deal we give the Russians is still the best deal on the table, but suddenly they have this offering in the East. That is, why not just lean towards the Chinese or the Indians or any country in the East? But yeah, that just took me to my last question, and I know we're running a bit out of time, so it's a short one, I guess. But given we now see that the U.S. not just challenged China, but the U.S. effectively has been defeated in Iran, at least that's what it looks like today, what does this mean for countries like Russia and China? I mean, how would it work to their advantage? Or would it work to their advantage?
Well, this is a huge question. I mean, not simple to answer. I think one could argue that after the United States is driven out of the Persian Gulf completely, or almost completely, the last thing the United States will want to do is think about fighting another war in the Persian Gulf, and that we will focus laser-like on on East Asia, and that this could be bad news for the Chinese. It's very important to understand that China's position in East Asia and Russia's position in the Ukraine war has improved because of the war against Iran. What's happened here is that, we've pulled all sorts of military assets out of East Asia to fight in the Middle East. And if you look at our Navy, which is really only capable at this point in time, given the limited number of ships we have, of fighting in one theater at a time, and you look at the wear and tear on the U.S. Navy that's taking place in this war in the Persian Gulf, it's quite clear that that is to to China's advantage. U.S. military forces in East Asia have been greatly weakened. And by the way, this is why the United States is now talking about putting more emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons. The United States is talking about shifting its doctrine. I think the last time we emphasized tactical nuclear weapons was in the 1950s when the Eisenhower administration was in control. But here we are talking about emphasizing tactical nuclear weapons because we've so badly damaged our conventional deterrence in places like East Asia. So I think in the short term, this has worked to China's advantage for those reasons. But I think over the long term, it may be the case that the United States, after this debacle in the Persian Gulf comes to an end, that will end up focusing much more on East Asia than we have certainly in recent months. But one key point you want to keep in mind here, Glenn, is that the United States is an incredibly powerful country. And what's happening in the Gulf and what's happening in Ukraine is not going to weaken the United States in terms of its actual power. We're going to remain as powerful as ever in terms of our capabilities. Where we're in deep trouble is more in terms of our ability to use that power. Right? Our ability to project power, our ability to win friends and allies around the world, all of that has been badly damaged as a result of this fiasco in Iran and as a result of the Ukraine fiasco as well. There's no question about that. But you don't want to underestimate the fact that the United States remains a remarkably powerful country and will remain a remarkably powerful country moving forward. This is analogous to what happened in Vietnam. The United States lost in Vietnam. It was a decisive defeat. But 14 years later, we won the Cold War and we emerged as a unipole. We emerged as the most powerful state on the planet. And all of this just illustrates that even though we're going to lose, if we haven't already lost the war in Iran, and I believe the Ukrainians and therefore the Europeans and the Americans are going to lose against the Russians in Europe, these pair of defeats will not weaken the United States in the sense that our power, our raw power, will be reduced. But we will be weakened in terms of our ability to project power and to influence countries diplomatically.
Yeah, I guess that's the problem of doing also security in terms of complete zero sum. Also when it's defined as defeating adversaries, because if the US now is facing defeat in Iran, as you said, then they would have to lean more into tactical nuclear weapons. You see the same in Europe, though, when they started to acknowledge that they will likely be defeated in Ukraine and the US is pulling a bit back from the continent. Suddenly you hear like the Germans, the Poles suddenly starting to flirt about nuclear weapons. Same as in Asia. I mean, if China gets its will that the US pulls out of Japan, for example, the Japanese might lean into nuclear weapons instead. So, you should be careful what you wish for. Of course, the same applies for Russia. I think the whole idea that, pushing Russia into a corner, escalating and assuming that it only has the option of capitulating, I think not. I think as well, they will then only go up that escalation ladder. And I think that's what we're seeing now. But anyways, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I would just say we live in very dangerous times. No question about that. Your point about Japan reminds me that Vladimir Putin recently visited the southern Kuril Islands, which the Japanese say belong to them. And this, of course, angered the Japanese greatly. And this just tells you that relations between Japan and Russia are terrible these days. And this is in large part because the Japanese have sided with the Ukrainians against the Russians. But also, the North Koreans recently launched a missile that landed in the waters just to the west of Japan. And furthermore, Japan and China have terrible relations today because of some comments that the Japanese prime minister made that enraged the Chinese. So here you have Japan that has significant problems with Russia, North Korea, and China. And at the same time, the United States, which is supposed to provide a security umbrella, certainly have its nuclear umbrella over Japan's head, has pulled forces out of Japan, out of South Korea, and has pivoted away from Asia in recent months because of the war against Iran. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what is the lesson that the Japanese are going to learn from that? And then this gets to the whole question of possible nuclear proliferation in Japan and the whole issue of where that leads. So you can just tell all sorts of stories today about how things are getting worse and worse rather than better and better, not just in the Gulf and in Ukraine, but also in East Asia now. So we are in a lot of trouble in a lot of different places where the potential for disaster is very great.